What I have for y'all today is a 3D printed model I designed and, well, printed out obviously, of a full floating axle assembly. Now, full floating axle assemblies, they're not that hard to kind of figure out how they operate in terms of their components and what all goes into them, but they can certainly be a bit challenging if you're just basing it on, if you're just looking at like different drawings and pictures, but not actually seeing one person. So hopefully this will kind of help put some confusion to rest on how these things actually work and some of the benefits along with this design. So again, this is a working model full floating axle assembly. And right here we can see back here, this represents our drive axle. So you can see these splined ends right here. I'll bring it closer to the camera. Obviously the actual axle itself isn't this small, but this is just to sort of make sure the design is compact. So this part of our hub assembly, basically that bolts up to our, you'll have an axle housing assembly like this, or differential housing. It's the same thing. And within that housing, you're going to have an axle that connects to the final drive assembly, to where, in relation to this, you would have your drive shaft rotating like this. And then your final drive gear engages with the pinion gear coming off that drive shaft within the housing assembly, and it converts this rotation, it splits at 90 degrees into this rotation, which in turn is going to rotate an axle like this, and that is going to result in our drive wheels finally rotating. So again, that's what this axle is. Just imagine that it extends out further into the differential and final drive assembly. So with that being said, now let's take a look at our actual rotating assembly. And remember, in order for rotation to actually happen, and it's still being physically bolted to the vehicle, we're going to have a bearing set in here. And what's different about this compared to a semi-floating configuration is the fact that this can handle a lot more vehicle loads. It's going to be made for like a much more robust and ultimately like a tougher design you can kind of think of. And we're going to explore and kind of look at what makes this design so interesting and unique. So on this, we're going to go ahead and take away our slotted rotor assembly. We're going to put this in the background. And what I'm going to do is this point right here, this little drive flange, this is where the design can slightly differ depending on the vehicle you're working off of. And for those of you that are curious of what this is based off of, it's just a generic design. I didn't really base this off of a vehicle. I just took some design elements and made like a generic full floating assembly. But on this one, these studs right here, normally you'll have either bolts securing this drive flange plate to it, or securing nuts, and all the nuts have been removed to where this little drive flange comes off. Now in this design, I have the flange incorporated as part of the actual drive axle assembly. Again, this is what's actually rotating via the final drive gear assembly that we talked about, right? So on this setup, you can have this flange plate actually be separate from it. Instead, it would just be like a shaft that runs through here. And on this end, there would also be a spline set kind of poking out like this. Let's see if I can kind of simulate that. So we can have it to where you would have a splined end on this end as well, and then you'd have a cover that engages with this and these little studs that kind of come off of there, to where anytime the axle rotates, well, because of the fact that that plate is splined to this and that, both of these components have to rotate, the hub and the axle. But in this case, the drive flange is going to be incorporated and be part of the axle assembly itself, right? And you can see how this actually passes through a little hollow cavity right here. This is part of the spindle assembly, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. So the spindle is going to be oftentimes a machine component that comes off of our axle housing itself, and you'll see that whenever I pop this hub assembly off. But what's interesting about this design is how this axle, again, passes through that spindle assembly, and whenever I rotate the axle, well, nothing happens until I actually spline it with, let me get these parts lined up real quick. There we go. So that is only going to rotate the drive wheel. Remember, that's going to hook up to these studs right here. That's where the wheel hooks up to there, or it bolts in place. And then again, that's what's securing the rotor. And then you'll have your caliper off of here and all that. But wheel rotation will only occur whenever that drive flange is linked to that hub assembly via this connection right there, right? So as soon as I undo that there and spin the drive axle, you notice, well, no power transfer occurs. On this one, what's good about this setup is the fact that even when I take this entire axle assembly out, we still have a rotating wheel. And that's very, very beneficial because of the fact that if you ever do any sort of off-roading or anything like that, if for some reason you have an axle that breaks, well, you have the ability to actually still have a rotating and functioning wheel. It would be a dead axle. You're no longer transmitting any torque or power to that wheel, but that's fine because we still have a rotating assembly, so you can get that out of you can still tow the vehicle if you need to because we still have a rotating wheel. If you have a semi-floating wheel setup on here, the bearing and hub assembly will actually come out with the axle on some setups. And so if you have an issue with that setup to where if you have an axle that breaks on there, well, you're dead in the water. You can't really go anywhere. Also, because of the fact that, well, we'll look at this design a little bit more, and then we'll talk about the differences, some other differences or benefits of a full floating design compared to a semi-floating design. But on here, we can already see one of the benefits is we still have a rotating wheel assembly, or hub assembly technically on this, without the axle having anything to do with that. So this axle on a full floating setup is only going to be responsible for transmitting the torque from the final drive assembly, the torque and power, to the drive wheels. It doesn't have to actually bear any of the vehicle weight, and we'll look at that in a second. So on this, if you look on the inside, I have these color coded so we can see this a bit easier. The hub assembly is in black, which we will have 2 tapered bearing sets in there. And then we have, on the end here, we have this securing nut. This is what's known as the lock nut assembly. This is what kind of keeps everything together from coming loose. That's not what actually sets the preload. So in order to actually remove that, you may be tempted to grab your handy chisel to pop these off. You don't want to do that. You're going to ruin that, and in a bind, sure, if you don't have any tools handy, but you need a special service tool like this. They won't always have, like the lock nut and preload nut won't look like this all the time. Sometimes it'll just be like a large hex nut, but on here, you can have this set up like this, and for that you would need a special service tool, and here's our special service tool that is also 3D printed. So on there, all you would do is, again, hook it up to your ratchet, extension, whatever, and then you're going to engage it with the notches, which I'm going to attempt to do. Let's see. So, use a large breaker bar to break that loose, obviously not with your, there's no way that should be that loose, right? But again, this is just a model. So we successfully took off our lock nut, and I'll lay these out so you can see how they're on there. So this is always the last component that you torque down to final spec. And, oh, I should have gotten, let's see if I can, I happen to have a little screwdriver. Let's see if I can pop that out. I may have to pick the whole model up. There's a lock washer on here, and hopefully I can kind of shimmy this thing out of here. Should have been a bit more prepared on this. You know what? Let's try this. Hey, actually worked. Here we have a lock washer. We'll talk more about this in a second. And then at the bottom, have another color-coded securing nut on there. So that's actually going to be your preload nut. Same thing, you'll notice that it still requires a special service tool. And the deeper down in here you go, I mean, you can't really get a chisel at the proper angle anyway. So we're going to take our special service tool. We're going to engage that preload nut, loosen that. And if you notice, whenever I start loosening this, the whole hub assembly starts becoming loose. So this nut that I'm removing actually sets the bearing preload. And remember what preload is you're sort of taking up the loose tolerances of the bearings and you're properly seating them on there. And we'll talk about that in just a second. If you notice on here, let's see if this thing can pick up and focus. Notice how there's a little tab that kind of sticks out like that, a little pin. So with this still in focus, I'm going to reach back here. I'm going to reach for this lock washer. If you notice, there's a bunch of holes on there, and those holes line up with that pin. So you can see I try to move it, and then I can move it to another one, it locks, move to another one, it locks. So that's actually key for ensuring this preload nut doesn't back off. If you notice, there's a little tab or key that sticks down, and that key will actually engage with a little keyway or slot in the spindle, and that basically indexes this in place and prevents it from moving. It's going to stay put. And you'll see why that's important whenever we talk about this preload nut in a second. But I'll put these back in the background. And now, finally, whenever you have all that, there's going to be a washer in there. I'm just going to pull this whole thing out, and you'll see the whole assembly now is able to be removed. And there is our inner washer. Place this in the background. And you can see, actually used, I think with these, I just used like trailer bearings or something like that. Just a scaled down version of it. But we can see, here's our tapered bearing with inner race. You can see how, again, everything rotates. Normally this will, not normally, it depends on your setup. If you have an enclosed hub assembly on here, normally this would be greased with a specific grade wheel bearing grease that'd be packed properly. And right here we have our outer race. I don't know if you can see that. That outer race for this bearing set, that's going to be pressed to the hub assembly. Basically these rotate as one. This should not rotate separately from that, right? And then on the other side we have our axle seal. We have our inner bearing assembly, and you can see that isn't coming out. That's because this seal is retaining kind of everything in place on there. So in order to actually take this bearing out and remove it, clean, inspect, and repack it and all that, you would have to pop this seal out. There are some tricks for popping this out without damaging it, but most of the time whenever you're getting in here to service this bearing, it's a good idea to pop that seal out and change it out. This little thing that I color coded, the little yellow and white segments right there, this is actually going to be your toothed or reluctor wheel for the speed sensor. And that, if you notice, let me go to our main model right here. You notice that hole up top right there? So that's where your vehicle speed sensor is going to go, and it's going to measure the hub rotation, which we know the wheel bolts up to that, right? So that's going to be how the ABS module is going to be monitoring the wheel speeds, and that's going to be for your ABS, stability control system, stuff like that, right? So whenever I install this in place, let's see if you can see this in the camera. So you can see that as the hub rotates, and remember our wheel ultimately bolts to this, you can see how the tooth pattern passes through there, and you're just going to have a sensor up top that's picking up that reluctor wheel rotation, which translates it into a speed signal. Either they'll use an analog or digital signal, just depends on the vehicle, and that's a topic we will look at a little bit later on. But yeah, you can see how we have a nice hub assembly that again is going to be separate from our axle. So now if we look back at this, we can get a better view of how the axle, so here's our spindle assembly, and this is all going to be machined. So this is going to be basically integrated as part of the axle housing assembly. They do make aftermarket kits to where you can swap out the ends and swap it from like a semi-floating to a full floating assembly. But on this, a lot of times they're just going to machine this down, and this is where the bearings will actually be in contact with it. So for example, the larger inner bearing right here, the tapered one, is going to be in contact with this part of the spindle, that raised section. The outer bearing right here, that's positioned in this, that is going to slide onto here, and it's going to be in contact with that part, right? This axle passes through the spindle assembly, and we know, again, that's being driven by the final drive assembly. But you can see, well, without the hub assembly, you aren't going to go anywhere, right? So the benefit of this design is the fact that, well, we already talked about it. If you have a situation to where you have a problem with the axle or something with this happens, again, we take this completely out of the equation, get rid of it, well, we still have a rotating hub assembly to get us out of trouble for towing purposes, stuff like that, right? So, and how I mentioned before, this is only responsible for transmitting the torque from the final drive assembly to the wheels, and that's it. With a semi-floating setup, you would have something like this. Basically, you would have the hub and bearing would be integrated as part of the axle, and that's because the bearing presses onto this axle assembly. So whenever you unbolt it, like the whole thing comes out together. And the problem with that semi-floater design, it's good for light duty stuff, but the problem is that axle not only has to transmit the rotational torque of this, it has to also deal with the weight of the vehicle. It has to support the weight of the vehicle as well, and that's just because of how it's hooked up to there. Now, I don't have a model for that, but to kind of explain that concept with the semi-floating axle, here I have a zip tie, and that just represents this axle assembly. So on a full floating setup, we know that this axle has nothing to do with supporting the vehicle weight, and that's because, well, whenever you take that out, we still, again, have a fully functioning rotating assembly, right? However, with the semi-floater, without getting into the details with that, this is something I actually mentioned in the lectures earlier on. So with a semi-floating setup, if this represents our axle, and over here this represents our drive wheel, the hand I'm making a fist in, basically what happens is whenever this end of it's going to be, let me make sure I'm in frame, so this end of it, again, represents the drive wheel, that's in contact with the road. Well, the more weight that's bearing down right here from the vehicle, basically what happens is, well, you can kind of see it, I'm going to exaggerate this movement, but basically here's our axle, and we have a support bearing let me just kind of put all this stuff right here. So here we have a support bearing on this end, and here's our drive wheel, and then this again is going to be in the axle housing assembly. But what happens is whenever there's more vehicle weight bearing down, basically the axle has to support that weight, and you can see how it starts deflecting the more and more weight I put right here, right? So again, clearly exaggerating this, but the point I'm trying to make here is that this axle has to bear some of that vehicle load because of the way it's hooked up to the vehicle, and that's on a semi-floating setup. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And again, I don't have a model of a semi-floater, just a full floating assembly right there. But again, the benefit of this is this assembly here, the hub and bearing assembly with the spindle, that's what's supporting the vehicle weight, as well as your lateral forces, radial forces, stuff like that. But the axle itself on a full floating assembly does not have to bear any of that load, and that's because, well, it's not, basically it's not going to be it's not going to be directly bolted to the wheels on there. It has to go through like a coupling setup on here. So I hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense with that regard. But back to our lock mechanisms right here and what is actually going on. So for preload, if you notice, I'm going to bring this close to the camera, notice how there's a little bit of slop in the bearing cage, the rollers, and the actual race itself. So whenever you set the bearing preload, basically you're taking all the slack out of that point. You're ensuring all of your components are seated on here, this outer race, as well as you're making sure there's no burrs on this thread right here. So initially what you do is you set a high torque amount to kind of seat everything together, right? That is not your final torque though, because if you over torque it, these bearings are going to basically, there's going to be a lot of friction between it, and you'll notice if you try to rotate the wheel, it'll barely rotate. And that first torque setting you use is not the one. It's to set that, it's to basically make sure everything seats in place and prepare for the final preload adjustment step. At that point, you loosen it, and then a lot of times you just sort of hand snug this preload adjustment nut, and what that does is it basically takes excessive slack or slop out of this bearing while maintaining contact in between the inner and outer races. And it's sort of a fine line between, you want to have enough tightness to where you're taking off the slop, but then you don't want it to be too tight to where everything's basically being forced together and it's really hard for it to rotate. And again, if you have a repair manual, follow that to the tooth, because you do not want to mess that up. You do not want to have these customers come back with either the preload set too loose or too tight. If you had to pick between the lesser of the two evils, remember it's always better to be slightly on the loose side compared to too tight. But again, if you're on the loose side, these things basically act like hammers because, well, they're moving around a little bit too much, the little rollers, right? So whenever we get everything installed in place, let me kind of put this back together so we can kind of see. And I forgot if I mentioned this. I think I did, but this seal, it's going to be in contact with that race section right there. Again, prevents dirt and debris from coming into there. So anyway, we go ahead and we install that. I'm going to go ahead and install our bearing like so. I'm going to install our washer, distributes the load. Now with this one right here, oh, you know what? Sorry, I forgot to mention this. So see that little keyway or slot on the spindle assembly? That way it'll make better sense whenever I talk about it. So see, again, that little tab that sticks down from our lock washer? See how I'm not able to rotate it? This stays in place. This preload nut, whenever we set this to our final torque specification, basically it's just about hand tight. And if they do give a torque spec on there, we're talking about inch pounds, or a very, very low foot-pound equivalent, like 5 foot-pounds, if that. So it's like, well, what keeps this thing from backing off? This does, because this is indexed in place, and remember there's a little tab sticking out on this preload nut that engages with one of these holes right here, and because this can't rotate, well, if it locks with our preload nut, look at what happens. I'm trying to rotate this back, but I can't, and obviously this would be wedged up against there. With this guy, that will be torqued down to a higher rating. That locks everything together and prevents anything from basically moving, right? So hopefully that'll get some insight on what I'm doing whenever I put this on there. So, we'll take this off, like so. Go ahead and put our hub and bearing assembly on there, hopefully without dropping us. This is why I don't like to, granted, I'm kind of working off camera, it's a little bit hard. This is why generally I like to install the outer bearing Here, I'll show you what I mean. I don't like to keep the outer bearing in there when I install it, because if you don't have it lined up perfectly, I'll show you what happens. See, exactly, that thing falls out. So I install the hub assembly first, then I take my bearing, and again, you want to make sure these are packed. If you're dealing with that setup to where the hub is separate from the housing assembly, so make sure you have it kind of fully seated in there. Then we're going to get our washer, our preload nut. Make sure the tab is facing the correct way, facing out. And we're going to go ahead and get that started. Hopefully not cross thread. I know, I'm turning it the wrong way. I'm just trying to get it seated. There we go. So I'll get that going. And I'm going to simulate basically our first initial torque setting. So this is, remember, the first setting you're going to do, and at the same time, let's get that engaged with the notches. Trying to feel for it without, oh, there we go, without actually looking at it. So whenever you do that, it's a good idea to usually spin the wheel as you're tightening it. It kind of ensures that everything is seating properly. So the first one you do, when you crank down on it, it's a really high torque setting on there. And what you'll notice is, let me try to do this without stripping anything. What you'll notice is, see how it doesn't really rotate? But again, that's the first step. That's just to make sure all the components are fully seated properly. You're overcoming any burrs on the threads that's going to affect your final torque. Then what you do is you get your tool, you back it off. Oh dang, I really cranked down on that. So you back that off until it becomes loose. And then what you're going to do is take the tool again. And then basically, again, while you're rotating it, you're just going to either, they'll tell you to hand snug it up, and that's one of the hardest things to kind of get a feel for, to where you literally just kind of hand snug it tight. And usually they give you like a backlash or clearance check at the end, to where you're basically checking with the wheel on. You check you sort of shimmy the wheel and see if there's excessive play or anything like that. And sometimes they'll give you a rotational torque spec, like how much force it takes to actually get this thing turning. If your preload's set too tight, it takes a higher torque value than spec. If it's too low, then this is basically easier. But the point is, whenever you get that set properly, again, we're just using enough clamping force to take up sort of the slack on the bearings and get them seated properly, to where now you can see, well, it rotates a lot easier, right? So you're sort of going in between that nice butter zone for not too loose, not too tight on there. But remember, just because this is essentially, even again on these larger vehicles, it's basically just sort of hand snug, not super, super tight. Again, go with whatever specifications they tell you. This is just sort of a generic walkthrough. Well, we want to prevent that thing from actually, that preload nut from backing off. So that's where our lock washer comes in, right? So now this part I'm going to have to kind of tilt towards me so I can see where that little tab is. Okay, so after messing with that out of frame for a little bit of time, I was just ensuring that the pin was lined up with this lock washer right here. So you may be wondering, it's like, well, if I'm working on a vehicle and, you know, I set my preload properly and I go to put this on, obviously there's not this lock washer on, obviously there's not an infinite amount of holes right there. So what if I put this on and it doesn't line up properly with, and just to kind of bring it in closer, so hopefully you can kind of see this. Let's get this thing to focus. There we go. So like, what if that lock washer doesn't line up with that little tab, that little pin that sticks out? What do you do then? A lot of the times what they tell you to do is you take your tool right here and you'll engage it with that, and you'll basically back it off slightly until it lines up properly with one of these holes. Now I just happen to, let's see if I can actually, let me get this snugged up a little bit. So I think I got lucky last time and it actually lined up, but we'll see on this. And again, kind of working out a frame, maybe hard for you to see this, but I'm going to install this. And in this case, I am not successful with it lining up. So what I'm going to do is get that lock washer out, or attempt to. There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back it off just slightly. Let's see if I can get that lined up on there. And the reason why you don't, if you have your preload set properly, again, you have to kind of play around with it. If you have a final lash specification or like rotational torque to see if you're within specification, you can kind of gauge like if you need to loosen a bit, or potentially if you can get away with tightening it a bit more to line it up. But usually you don't want to tighten it anymore, because then you can put too much too much preload on those bearings. But the goal is to make sure that that tab lines up with that lock washer, if that makes sense. So now it's properly lined up with that hole. And again, the preload nut is that one that's only supposed to be hand snug. That's what's actually setting your bearing preload. But to prevent everything from flying apart, you're going to have a lock nut a lot of times like this. On some vehicles, you can have like a castle nut on the end. That's your preload and your lock nut, like sort of all in. Well, no, I don't want to. Yeah, actually, on some setups, like some setups that have serviceable bearings like this, they'll have a castle nut with a cotter pin on there that kind of does a similar thing. So instead of a cotter pin, well, we're gonna have a lock nut on here. So same thing. This is going to thread into place like that. And you're gonna get it started. And this is the one that's torqued down to a high value. So, like for example, that first preload nut on full floating assembly, we'll say like that one is, we'll say 60 inch-pounds, something like that, right? Not very much. And this one may be something like 60 foot-pounds on the outside, because again, that's what locks everything together. If you guys have ever tightened two nuts against themselves, it's basically that's what we're doing here. So then you're going to take this, the torque wrench, and that's what's actually tightened down on there. So they tighten against each other. And then if it's successful, you'll double check your how the rotation is on there, make sure there's no excessive slack, make sure there's no binding issues like that. Then if you're happy with that, then all you do is take your drive axle, line it up, install your bolts or securing nuts in place. And for this particular model, I had it 180 degrees out. You can't see why on the camera, but it's fine. Okay, so yeah, you'll put this flange on, bolt everything down, secure it, and then we have our rotating assembly. Make sure, you know, check for any unusual noises, that that's all good, and then you basically install your rotor, your caliper bracket with your caliper, put the wheel back on, and voila, we have our rotating assembly again. So yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell, guys. This is a full floating axle setup right here, and hope that makes a bit more sense on what's actually going on.